Mozart's 11th Piano Sonata contains one of the most iconic movements of classical music ever. The first two movements are substantial in their own right, but the third movement, marked alla turca and commonly known as the Turkish March, is widely recognized among both classical music listeners and non-listeners alike. But Mozart never once visited Turkey during his lifetime. So what led him to mark the movement the way he did? Kind of seems like the answer to a third of all the history questions between the 14th and 18th centuries is in some way related to the Ottomans. And this one is no different. Here's the Ottoman Empire at its peak around 1699. Mozart would spend most of his time living here in Vienna, Austria, just on the cusp of the Ottoman Empire's territory. And the Ottomans did try to take Vienna too. The generation before Mozart's experienced the Battle of Vienna in 1683, an attempted siege by the Ottomans to capture the Austrian capital. The siege itself was ultimately unsuccessful, but a byproduct of the siege of Vienna, and the Ottoman Wars in general, was the introduction of what was perceived as Turkish-style music. Among the infantry and cavalry of the Ottoman forces were groups of musicians known as the Turkish Janissary bands. These bands were employed by the Ottomans to lift morale, keep soldiers awake and energized, and even instill fear into the opposition as they marched into battle. Given how expansive the Ottoman Empire stretched at its peak, it's easy to see how these Turkish Janissary bands were heard by and influenced many Central and Western Europeans. And eventually, Central and Western Europe adopted some of the musical ideas of these Turkish Janissary bands. And some would go on to successfully market and popularize that style of music. Exoticism is the quality of being attractive or striking through being colorful or unusual. From Beatlemania in the 60s to the creation of gangsta rap by NWA in the 80s, exoticism and the ability to differentiate from the norm has always been a valid way to gain an audience. In the 18th century, there was a general European fascination with all things foreign, and during a time when communication across large distances was done using horses, donkeys, and camels rather than phones, planes, and radio, much of the area that the Ottomans inhabited was viewed almost as if it was from a completely different planet. Mozart was a man who knew how to cater to the masses. In this instance, he did so by sprinkling in some exotic Turkish-style music into his 11th Piano Sonata. Etymology is the study of the origin of words, and the way in which their meanings have changed throughout history. And the definition of Turkish-style music varied depending on if you ask someone from Central Europe or from Turkey itself. Because much like French fries aren't French, and Jerusalem artichokes aren't from Jerusalem, Mozart's Turkish March and the interpretation of Turkish-style music by Central and Western Europe really wasn't all that Turkish. Remember when I mentioned the Turkish Janissary bands, and how that was one of the first instances of Turkish-style music many Europeans heard as the Ottomans were invading? Mozart's Turkish March imitates the sound of those Janissary bands. Steady, strong tones with trumpet and bell-like melodies. But Turkish music outside of the Janissary bands was much different. Turkish-style classical music was much more rhythmically complex. The Turks employed a rhythmic technique called usul, which was based on a series of strong and weak beats in uneven patterns. The melodic counterpart to usul is the Turkish makam, which is a system of melodic types. Each type of makam specifies an intervallic structure and melodic development ranging in complexity. But one of the main features of Turkish makam is the use of microtones. The smallest interval up to that point in Western music was the semitone, two adjacent notes on the piano. But the Turkish makam subdivided the frequencies between those two notes even further. Those subdivisions are also known as microtones. And finally, one of the most distinguishing features of Turkish-style music is its heterophonic texture. Instrumentalists often all played the same melody and improvised on it with slight ornamentation, but a harmony underneath that melody appears to have been much less common. So in reality, Mozart had no concept of the characteristics of Turkish classical music. But his Turkish March is not at all improperly named. The march as a Western music form was expressly written for marching to, and marching was most frequently performed by a military band. And the Turkish military bands are the inspiration Mozart used for this piece of music. In the end, the name Turkish March encapsulates the essence of the piece, one derived from the Ottoman invaders marching into Vienna in an attempt to expand their empire.